Hello everyone, my name is Dylon Schulte, and welcome to my virtual senior project at the Legal Studies Academy in First Colonial High School. And for those who don't know, in your senior year at the Academy, your senior project splits into 2 semesters. The first semester, you write a paper about a topic of your choosing, and the second semester, you carry out a physical project about the topic that you chose. And while I wasn't able to carry out my physical project due to COVID-19, I am able to do a virtual project and still meet my intended goal. And for clarification, my intended goal for this senior project was basically to just inform and engage any individual about the problems that income inequality presents. And so with that said, my virtual project is an audio interview with a very important intellectual at the Manhattan Institute. And this is no other than Nicole Gelinas. And Nicole Gelinas is basically an expert in urban economics and finance. And I was very lucky to score an interview with her and basically have a conversation about income inequality, its causes, its effects, and the problems that revolve around it. And so with that said, before I show you guys the actual audio interview, I do want to share a couple quick facts about income inequality just to prep you. And so for those who don't know, the most basic definition of income inequality is a large concentration of wealth in a small population of people. And so for context, Congress did a study from 1979 to 2007. And within that span, the top income bracket, their income grew roughly 275%, while the bottom income bracket, their income only grew 18%. And so I do think that it is critical to understand that that growth and that acceleration and that disparity is so large that it's kind of overlooked in the sense that America isn't approaching that as its biggest problem right now. And with that said, to give even more context, if you look at CEO compensation since 1978, the average CEO wage has grown 940%, while the average worker has only grown 12%. 12 versus 940. Again, it's very important that we don't deem these facts as trivial and we actually look at the problem that America's inequality within its economy has grown at such an alarming rate, and we need to stop this acceleration. And so with that said, again, now before I enter the interview, I have 2 things I want everyone to understand, is that first of all, within this interview, income inequality at first can seem very simple. However, do understand that this is a problem that has challenged economists, politicians, scientists, and intellectuals for hundreds of years, and this is a problem that has started ever since the beginning of humanity, and that's inequality. And secondly, the interview in of itself, I actually performed basically an impromptu interview. I gave myself an outline because I have researched quite a bit about income inequality, and I wanted to see what pressing concerns and what questions I had right at the moment. So I did follow an outline, but I'm sorry if some of my questions do seem a little bit jumpy, but Miss Gelinas still gave me wonderful answers, and she still was able to engage with me, and I'm so happy I had that opportunity. Thank you, both the Academy and as well Miss Gelinas, and I hope you guys enjoy. And like looking at how it's like grown in America specifically, would you say that income inequality is like uniquely unsolvable?
I don't think it's unsolvable. There are various ways to approach the issue, and they get you to a different definition of solution. But for example, we have a redistributive federal tax system. We could make the federal tax system even more redistributive so that more of the tax revenues are paid by the top 20%, 10%, one of earners. And not only do middle class and lower income people not pay taxes, but they actually get net tax credits back through the earned income tax credit. So that's one way of approaching it, is just saying, okay, we're going to lop some off the top and give it to everybody else. And then other ways are in spending more public money, not on just redistributing the tax money into people's individual hands, but on more public services that help people towards the bottom and the middle of the income scale. So better educational quality of education for poorer students, paying teachers in poorer communities more so that you can attract more skilled teachers, more library hours, better public transportation. Like someplace like Detroit, only 9% of the people take public transportation, but they tend to be poorer people going to essential jobs. So better frequency and quality of public transportation. So, doing sort of a little bit more of what some European countries already do. I mean, like a daycare. Like if you look at France's creche system, every child can go to free daycare from about 18 months. So, both more direct spending on anti-poverty and anti-inequality problems, and also just redistributing more of the tax revenue.
Okay, so it's less solving and it's more mitigating the impact, right?
Right.
Okay.
I don't think we'll ever solve it. And what would be the definition of solving? I mean, is it that you want everyone to have basic health care, basic education, some kind of opportunity in life, no matter what circumstances that they're born into? Or do you want everyone to have perfectly equal income? I mean, that would come with a lot of problems too, including less incentive to take risks, start businesses, and so forth. But there are certainly ways to mitigate it.
Okay, yeah, that like is clear. And so like with that, like I do agree that a big problem is that specifically we have this large concentration of wealth for like the top, I would agree, like top 1, top 20, top 5, however you want to classify them. And I do think that's a problem. But then like considering that, like how we have large concentration of resources like in specific areas, do you think that like considering what the coronavirus has currently done to Americans and everything that's been going on, do you think that this could collapse America in the future if we don't mitigate it soon?
Well, I think it sort of concentrates the problems and solutions that were already entering the mainstream. I mean, you're you were, I guess, entering your teenage years when Bernie Sanders entered the presidential arena 4 years ago.
Yes, ma'am.
If you were to say 15 years ago, would Bernie Sanders ever gain traction in a primary election? Many people would have said, no, his ideas are too radical. They're so outside the mainstream. The idea of Medicare for all and free higher education, those things, they would just never gain the public's attention. And now those ideas are pretty much mainstream. It will be highly unlikely for Biden not to adopt some of Sanders's more specific Medicare for all plans as we go into the general election. Things like student loan debt. I mean, that's become a mainstream issue, and certainly like higher minimum wage. I mean, a lot of progressive states have gone to the $15 minimum wage, with the lower wage workers making up the core of the private sector essential workforce. I think we'll get better protections for minimum wage workers, probably even a $20 or more minimum wage, better safety net protections for supposedly gig workers like Uber and Lyft drivers. So, and this certainly shows that, like as Sanders said in his suspension speech the other day, that we can't treat healthcare as a privilege that you get from your employer. We most likely will get some sort of basic healthcare option that's, it really just expands what we already have. I mean, we've got Medicaid for poorer people. Biden already wants to lower the Medicare age down to 60 from 65. And so what do you do with everyone in the middle of working age but without very good health care benefits? Probably some combination of expanding Medicaid, expanding direct payments to hospitals, and lowering the Medicare age even more. But yes, I think this does point up all of the pre-existing issues, even things like being able to learn from home. I mean, if you're middle class or upper class and your home is filled with books and everybody has a computer and a fast internet connection, you can learn more at home than somebody whose mother is a single parent, maybe not very many books in the home, no reliable internet connection, and a 15-year-old computer. So those things are certainly exacerbating the crisis.
And that actually, because this was going to be one of my questions down the road, but you started talking about it, and you were talking about policies that can help Americans right now. And then with that, I've seen like a policy that's grown in popularity is a universal basic income. And I was wondering, like, what is your thoughts on like using a UBI maybe right now to help mitigate the impact?
Well, we're doing a very bare bones UBI in sending most adults who make less than $100,000, $1,200, an extra $500 per child as part of the CARES Act, the third round of federal rescue that Congress passed 2 weeks ago. I think it will certainly become a bigger point in the discussion, and we may see a version of it like just permanently higher child tax credit. So anyone with a child gets a couple $1,000s a year to raise that child. On the broad level of giving money to every adult, I think it starts to be problematic because there are huge parts of the country that don't need it. And so unless we have infinite power to borrow at the federal level, are you spending $1 trillion a year on giving this money to people making well into the very high 5 figures, low and mid 6 figures, who don't need the money? And then what is the level of universal basic income? I mean, are you talking, what the rescue package did with $1,200, or are you talking something more substantial, like something like $1,000 a month? I mean, I think we'll start to talk about it, but I would be reluctant to support a broad UBI program because the cost of it might mean we are taking away from direct basic public services that also help, tens of millions of people.
Okay. And then so like considering that, like basically the policies that have been presented by like the right, the left, and like with also the media, do you think that like income inequality has been downplayed based on its significance?
I think it was downplayed up until the financial crisis, where if you were young adults in the early 1990s through the end of the Clinton years, so through the turn of the millennium, that the attitude toward income inequality, which was really both the left and the right, because there just wasn't much of a left and the right. I mean, everything was focused on the center. That the attitude was, there's really no inequality problem because we just have to fix opportunities. So everyone should get a better opportunity to go to school, and then they can go to college, and then they can get a good job. And so you solve the problem. And then if someone happened to work at a manufacturing plant or a job that was either automated or offshored, it was just, well, you can retrain those people. Those people can get other high-paying jobs. And that obviously turned out not to be the case for huge parts of the country. It hollows out communities and cities and towns and states, even if the people who can get a better job do, because you're leaving people behind who can't. And even spending money on education, there's just so many disadvantages to being born poor. It helps. I mean, New York City spends $30,000 per school child, but it doesn't completely solve the problem. And I think it became clearer that we were concentrating way too much wealth in the financial system. When the financial system fell apart in 2008 and Congress and the Federal Reserve implemented all of these bailout packages, then it really became the center really fell apart. So we got a specific left and a right that both said we are against these bailouts and we want something different. And so that focused a lot more attention on inequality. I mean, on the side of the right, you saw the Tea Party. It didn't really go very far. But then over the past couple of years, you saw all of these protests in right-leaning states for better teacher pay. You see more attention to the opioid crisis in places like West Virginia. And then on the left, of course, the whole Bernie movement, which really has changed what is the mainstream of politics.
And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then, so what would you say, like, obviously, so I've actually, like, I wrote a paper about this topic. It was a part of my senior project, and it was an important, like, part that hit me was, like, what causes income inequality? Like, where does it stem from? And, like, obviously, you look it up and there's multiple answers. But the one that, like, has kind of, I guess, dawned on me, like, kind of hit me the most is globalization, because that one kind of makes the most sense to me. And so, would you consider that the primary cause of income inequality, or would you say that there's, like, another factor, like technology and, like, automation surpassing workers, or?
I think over the past 40 years, since the beginning of the Thatcher-Reagan years, globalization was the biggest accelerator. That was the same argument, like when Clinton gave one of his State of the Union speeches. It might have been for the year 2000. He made a big point of saying he had bought shirts that were manufactured in Africa so that he could support African jobs. Mm-hmm. And at the time, like, no one was saying, well, wait a minute, we want to support Africa, but we also need jobs here. And I think as the offshoring of jobs accelerated, particularly to China, which just had such a huge low-wage labor force, this whole political stance still continued that we will just retrain everybody and we will benefit from globalization. I mean, the wealth of the country as a whole, up until the pandemic, probably benefited from globalization, but it was not equally spread out. I mean, the money went to people in the financial sector and private equity, in securitization, in basically lending Americans money to make up for their lost income across the whole, like the bottom 65% of the workforce really hasn't gotten a raise since, in real terms, since the 1970s. And so this has created a lot of the political unrest over the past 12 years that has really surprised the establishment. Yeah, so on immigration, we could mitigate inequality on a national basis by just barring low-wage workers from coming to the country. But then have you really made them better off? Arguably, you might have made some of your native-born people better off by cutting the labor pool. So that's also like an issue that it depends on how you define the problem and who you are trying to help with it. But yeah, certainly automation in the retail area. I think, unfortunately, we will see even more automation of retail work as people are uncomfortable with interacting with a cashier, as companies like Amazon automate even more of the warehouses so that they don't have to have so much close human interaction. Things like autonomous cars, I mean, it's going to be yet another argument that we don't want human drivers in such close proximity to so many strangers every day. So I think that will be a force that continues to increase inequality, both economic inequality and income inequality.
Then, okay, and then this is kind of going to be near my final question. I know I've asked a lot. I'm sorry for putting you through all of it.
No, it's fine. I think they were very good questions.
Thank you so much. This is this is amazing for me. Thank you. It's a wonderful experience.
Oh, you're welcome.
And then I kind of just working down, so with like the implications that coronavirus has put on Americans, like I would say it's pretty clear that a lot of Americans have become more welfare dependent. If not that, they have become less independent because for like a good amount. And I would say walking out of this pandemic, if it does end, how do you think it will like have an effect on like the American workforce and like those who have been put out of work?
I think it will make labor more powerful in the short term. That we've really seen a sort of brutal natural experiment in what does it mean to just shut down all of the 40% of the economy that actually needs to interact with the public. And obviously it's not very good, and it will trickle up to the middle classes and the upper middle classes as well. I mean, the longer that the economy is shut down. So certainly in the short term, I think labor will have more power and be paid better, probably through more government regulations. I mean, things like higher minimum wage will spread to the national level from the state level, better healthcare options, likely bigger tax credits for wage income and so forth. But in the long term, yes, technology and automation will come out of this pandemic stronger because the tech industry will argue it's a resiliency issue. If you can have a robot deliver your food, then you have a better protected supply chain. And then I think there's also the issue of, are people willing to spend money starting in the fall and the winter? And does that mean restaurants can open up again, retail, movies, Broadway, entertainment, tourism? Does all of that bounce back very quickly? Because if not, we may have higher paid essential service workers, but people who work in the restaurant industry and the tourist industry may have more months on unemployment.
Okay, and then I basically this will be my second to last question, and I have just one last one, but like considering like everything that's like we've gone through, like the causes, the implications. Before I ask this, is it okay if I just ask so I don't forget? Is there anything else you'd like me to know specifically? Anything that'll like help me?
No, I think you've been pretty comprehensive. I'll try to find that other person's author, the author's name, and send it over to you later today.
You're totally fine. But if you can, that'd be wonderful.
Sure.
And then basically my final question is, so I would agree that something that can help mitigate income inequality is the policy benefits that can roll over to Americans coming down the road. But for those that have to wait for that, what can individuals do to like lessen or at least cushion the impact of income inequality?
Well, I think certainly on an individual basis, people who can afford to should continue to make donations to essential charities. I mean, in this situation, just things like donating to the local food bank. I mean, it's very, just getting seniors meals and getting poor people meals to supplement SNAP benefits is pretty important. I think things like donating to like after school programs, arts programs for poorer children, anything that makes up for the sort of lack of human interactions that the poorer children are experiencing right now is a good thing. I think longer term, things like, do you want to donate to a wealthy university that already has a huge endowment, or do you want to donate to schools that can, like elementary, middle, and high schools, so that poorer kids can have school supplies? But I certainly think there's a lot to be done on the individual level. Even people who don't have a lot of money to give. I mean, $20 can buy, a lot of bulk food for people.